As you saw from the tease in the last video, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. It's finally time to start bolting parts together, and there's a lot to do before we're ready to steam in the frames at the end of September. So, it's a good thing we've got plenty of help. The sculptor, Bob Emser, who is bridging over from art to boat building, came to help us with the first steps, mating the keels and putting up the stern timbers. Bob is also starting his own channel, The Art of Boat Building. As we start with putting the aft deadwood in place, it's important to note that obviously one of the most important aspects of the boat is that its joints are watertight. Tar and tar paper are some of the bedding compounds used for this.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, up, forward. Cool. So I would do one on either side, Alex, and not actually have them on the top.
I was going to say you do this with this tar on the side.
Okay. Yeah.
We've been doing well moving this massive piece of wood up to now, but setting it down onto the tar safely could be challenging. We are also going to be erecting some larger parts after this, so Bob suggested that we construct a simple gantry crane for these next steps, and as we had been already considering it, this is a logical next step.
Okay, down still.
I can go from down here if I can use my legs.
Okay, ready?
1, 2.
Looks like you need to go your way. Go ahead, throw the board up there.
Good.
Good. We did it! We bolted parts of a boat together. Super psyched. So the first keel bolt is in. It goes through the keel timber, through the tip of the aft deadwood, and through the ballast keel. So now we're going to put on the nuts and the washers for it. And we're going to show you what we're going to do here on the top, but we're going to do this on the bottom. It's just easier to explain now. We're going to take a little bit of this cotton caulking, and we're just going to wrap just a little bit around the head. We'll clip it off, put the washer on, we'll put the nut on, and we'll suck it down really, really tight. And the idea with that is that just like cotton caulking between planking seams, the cotton's going to compress down there, it's going to fill up all those little voids, and when it hits the water, the cotton's going to swell and it's going to seal that joint up. And hopefully that'll help keep a lot of water from coming in at the ballast keel and traveling up the keel bolts. So we're going to do that on all the principal backbone fastenings on the outboard edge on the outside of the boat.
And yes, we did think of drilling the counterbores at the bottom of the lead keel. A little while ago, we were visited by two awesome Canadians, Charles and René, who helped us flip the keels, and then we used a homemade counterbore bit that Joe made for us.
That's a great sound. Okay, that's about all for rope.
Yeah?
Starting to deform the washer, so.
I'd say that's good then.
With the deadwood attached, it's time to move on to the stern timber and the dovetail joint that connects the two.
Let's go up onto the keel.
A quick test fit to see what needs to be adjusted, and then this joint gets the same treatment of bedding compound.
Alex, making a caulking hammer.
That's it. That's how farther it's going. Now that the stern timber is up, we need the hardware to bolt it together. We could buy carriage bolts for it all, but that would be really expensive. So instead, we bought all the bronze rod that we needed, and then we've been cutting and threading them ourselves. Now in the bow assembly, a lot of the pieces are really thin, so to countersink enough for a nut and a washer and still put a cap of bung over it, it has to be really deep. So because of the bow, we need to make these things called fin head bolts, which are basically a homemade version of a carriage bolt. And since we had to make them for the bow anyways, we might as well use them for the stern and save ourselves some money, so we don't need a nut and a washer on the end that we use the fin heads for. This is a fin head bolt. So it's basically a homemade version of a carriage bolt. We take a die that lets us form this head, and it lets us, more importantly, form these little wings here. And these wings ideally would be a little bit bigger, but since we're in such hard oak, there'll be more than enough bite for this to hold. And the idea is you drill a hole the size of the shaft, you put this in, we can shape this head a little bit if we need to alter its size. And then when it starts to pull tight, these little wings here get locked into the oak and they keep it from spinning. So it's the same principle as a carriage bolt. This is just a homemade version of it. It's called a fin head bolt. Dies for making fin head bolts are not commercially available, so we didn't have any other option but to make our own. And there's not a ton of information out there about making them. So we went through a little bit of trial and error. We had our friend Joe, who's been helping us a lot, do the machining, and he made us a die, which is basically 2 plates of steel with a hole drilled down the center, and it dished out to form the head. And we tried that with the propane weeder and the acetylene torch, and we couldn't really get the fins to form. So what we ended up doing was filling in the countersink and going to a die that was flat across the top with just 2 little fins cut out to form the fins. And that, with preheating the die with the acetylene, or with the propane, and then heating the head with the acetylene and beating it with a ball peen hammer, we found that we could get the heads formed pretty well and get the fins formed pretty well. And now we're up and running. So this all gets preheated, the rod gets clamped in. We tighten these up with the big breaker bar, really snug it, really clamp down on that rod, and then we can heat it up and hit it. And as we heat it and hit it, it slowly forms into these grooves that we cut into the head, and we end up with our fin head bolts.
As Steve said, it took us a little trial and error to find a die shape and process that worked well, but in the end, we got a pretty good system down. With the heads formed, it's on to cutting the threads.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, back to the boathouse where we need to check alignment before putting anything together.
We just gotta run that out to the center lines.
Okay. You're like an 1/8 inch over the center line.
This way?
Yeah.
Top of keel at station 8 is 137.5. Okay. 138.
So, break that way 1/2 inch, not even.
Close enough. If you've noticed, we put all sorts of different goop and gob on all of the timbers, and the reason for that is to help protect them from rotting. So back here we have the stern post, and the stern post is covered with 2 coats of shellac and then 2 coats of anti-fouling paint. And the anti-fouling paint acts as like an antifungal, antimicrobial, keeps all the little critters from eating it, and the shellac keeps the wood from absorbing the bedding compound, whether that's tar or dolphinite. Anything outside of the rabbet, so outside of the boat, outside of the planking, is getting bedded with tar. So that's the ballast keel to the keel timber and the deadwoods to the keel timber and ballast keel. Everything inside the rabbet is going to get bedded with dolphinite, which is a time-tested bedding compound. You can get it pretty much anywhere. We got ours from Jamestown Distributors. And if you don't seal the timbers, what'll end up happening is the timbers will eventually leach the oils out of the dolphinite and out of the tar. And that won't hurt the dolphinite or the tar, but it'll greatly reduce the capacity of it to act as a bedding compound. Because ideally you want bedding compounds to never dry out. So if the timber swells and moves and does anything, the bedding compound should just be this sticky, goopy stuff in there that moves and shakes with it. So now these are all ready, and we're going to go through and paint all the fang surfaces now, or coat them rather, with dolphinite, and now we can put the timbers on. In any place in a boat where one timber meets against another, those faces where they come together is called a fang surface. So all fang surfaces get the 2 coats of shellac, the 2 coats of anti-fouling paint, and then last but not least bedded in either dolphinite or tar. Nose down. Pull things down. Ready?
With the inner stern post firmly clamped in place, it's time to start drilling the first holes.
Okay. I can judge this way really well, right and left,
And you're set down a little bit.
because I can just keep these parallel, but up and down is what I'm going to need your help with. Yeah.
In anticipation of comments to come, yes, we are drilling by eye. 2 sets of eyes, large timbers, and an amazing drill bit made it very easy to drill accurate holes.
You're up there.
You can hear it.
Okay. Oh, stop.
I see it.
Okay.
Yeah, right there. Up. Right there.
Let me just blow out from the other side.
Yep.
The next step after the hole's drilled is to countersink it so that we can put a plug or a bung on the outboard edge, and so that the washer can sit flat against the timber on the inside edge of the boat. And our friend Joe, we keep mentioning Joe, thank you Joe, he's been a big help. He found us these countersink bits made by Milwaukee, and then he made this little stud that goes into it. Normally there's like a little lead screw there, and we can put this stud in, and then when we go to countersink, we can put the stud in the hole, and it'll line the countersink up perfectly so that the bottom of the countersink is exactly 90 degrees to the edge of the hole that we bored, so that everything sits nice and flush. So thank you, Joe. So we're poisoning the holes, just in case any little creepy collies want to try to make it their home. Okay, give me a wrap.
There's a bolt right near the prop aperture, that's the opening where the propeller sits, where we wouldn't have been able to get the counterboard deep enough, so we opened that up a bit with a chainsaw, and the prop aperture will get properly cut out when the time comes. Now, the rest of these bolts are all the same process, so we won't dwell on those. The longest one though, which goes through each and every one of the timbers back there, required a little bit of redistribution of dirt.
I'm standing here with Victoria, who we acquired this past fall, and she was built in 1926, and she's an Atkin double ender, and we are building an Atkin double ender, which is kind of cool. Unfortunately for Victoria here, she did not receive the care and maintenance that she deserved, and she fell on hard times, which is how we ended up with her. And she was destined to be cut up, and all of the mahogany get put in the dumpster, and all the bronze get parted out and sold on eBay. So thankfully she came to us, and we are using as much of Victoria as we can in Arabella. So everything that is solid on Victoria, hopefully such as this bobstay, will go into Arabella. And now that Arabella's stern is up, it's time to do her stem. And when we bolt the stem together, we need to make sure that we don't put a bolt where we need to put the bobstay. So instead of trying to pull patterns and measurements, we figured it would be easier just to take this bobstay off, make sure it's good and solid, bring it over to the stem, make sure it's going to fit and work, and if it does, then we can mark exactly where the two holes are for it to hold the bobstay on, so that when we bolt the stem together, we don't end up inadvertently messing up and having a bolt be where a bolt needs to be later on. Alright, let's fire up the grinder and the drill and see if we can get these pins out. Hopefully the bobstay comes off without much of a fight. Alright, there she is. The bobstay.
Now, onto the bow. The process is exactly the same, but we were able to do the drilling and the bolting for the stem on the bench. And then, with the 4-foot separate, we figured out where all the bolts needed to land. Again, an important process to make sure that the bolts don't land under floor timbers or in any other uncomfortable places. For our second round of bolt making, we had a new friend stop by. Noel dropped by on his way from Chicago to the Massachusetts coast. After gifting us a couple of planes, he was eager to lend a hand, so we were happy to oblige.
So yeah, I'm trying to just kind of, we have to start by mushrooming it a little bit, and then we keep trying to work it back to the center and work that center down and in to form those fins. So it's like shaping with the little hammer, and then like driving with the big hammer, and then shaping with the little hammer. At least this is what we've
figured out how to do. I don't. There could
Yeah,
very
we
well
found
be
our
a
own
much better
technique.
way to do it.
Right. Well, when this video comes out, some blacksmith is gonna
But he's gonna tell us.
tell you how you should have done it.
Yep.
One thing not mentioned earlier is that since the recessed head on the die didn't work, the threader paired with a grinder and a block drilled with a counterbore to check the size worked perfectly.
You guys, you can that stuff
And then it's time for assembly.
In what, like 2 years? We're finally at this point?
It's been like 2.5.
Alright, so what are we doing, Steve?
We are putting the final pieces of the backbone together. So we jointed the wood keel and the lead keel and the aft deadwood and the stern post and the inner stern post and the stern knee last week. And yesterday we bolted up the stem here, and I got the gantry crane set up and hung the forefoot. So now we can easily line that up, bolt these together, and then we'll use the gantry crane to pick up the whole stem assembly, line it up, and bolt it on the remaining assembly.
Pop it right up. We got a couple people coming in to help today, so we can stand this up easily and not have any worries of trying to do it by ourselves.
By the end of the day, she'll look like a boat.
Oh.
Too bad. So that's just needs to go that way a little bit.
Yeah.
These counterbores Joe made us are
No question.
freaking sweet.
With the stem firmly secured to the forefoot and a good coat of dolphinite laid down, Kat and Evan helped us lift and situate the whole bow assembly onto the keel timber.
We're just gonna more on there.
It's not crazy far off, especially considering how little that needs to move to accomplish that.
You're following these lines here? Inside?
Yeah, so we'll start up here first.
The bow is now situated, but before we can put in the final bolts, we need to get the deadwood under there.
Now I think we're ready to tar. We'll tar this, we'll tar that. Yeah. All right, Kat, wanna come over? I'll walk you through all this processy here. I'm gonna tar the top of this. I'm gonna lay the paper down, smush it all in the tar. I'm gonna lay another layer of tar over it. This top will be prepped. And then we're gonna go down to the bottom there. We'll pull out that marker stick and I'll tar up underneath that felt paper, push that felt paper in. I'll tar in over the felt paper. And then without touching this and trying not to make a big mess, we have to carry this over and slide the nib end up into there. And then once it's up and in, you guys can just kind of hold this end. And I'll throw some blocks on top of the battle jacks. And it'll take me a minute. You have to hang out there and hold it for a sec. But I'll jack the jacks up until they're pushing against this up against the keel. Once that's up against the keel, we can pull the rope and put it through the notch over here, hook it back up to the other come-along, and we'll have to have one person on either side of the come-along just ratcheting about at the same time. And we'll just kind of snug it back. And then we'll have to kind of probably tap it a bit with a board and the sledgehammer and play with it until we get the holes to line up. And then once we have the holes all lined up, we'll drive that rear bolt home. And then at that point we can worry about like aligning the front and getting all that. We'll move the jacks around a little bit and then we'll do the drilling.
Sounds good.
Any questions?
Good.
We'll get some gloves.
Back towards you.
What?
Towards you, yeah. Less.
Isn't that ridiculous?
That's insane.
That's through like white oak.
Yeah.
Yep. Alix for the win.
Alright, as you can see, the rest of this is pretty similar. The holes get some copper naphthenite. A little cotton under the washers. Then tighten down. And the same for the remaining 4 bolts. But the final product is amazing to see. Seeing her shape form as pieces come together is a wonderful feeling, and there's much more of that coming up in the next video as the molds go up. And speaking of things coming together,
We're steam bending the frames September 22nd and 23rd, and you all are invited to come watch if you want. We've got the work crew already put together, so there's no volunteer opportunities that weekend, but we are going to have the boathouse opened up and roped off, and people are more than welcome to come and hang out for a few hours or for both days and watch us steam bend all the frames. It should be quite the fun time.
And it's going to be super exciting, and we'd love to have the media come in as well, but we don't really have the time to contact them. So if any of you guys know of any publications or any news agencies that you think might be interested in this, feel free to shoot it to them for us. We'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, the more the merrier.
All right, we'll see you then.